It was supposed to be a normal night in my cell, the kind of night I had gotten used to after years behind these prison walls. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out. I didn't think much of it. That happened sometimes. The warden always said the place was falling apart, that the wiring was ancient and unreliable. But tonight, something felt different. Something heavy hung in the air, like the entire prison was holding its breath. I'm not a superstitious man. I don't believe in ghosts, demons, or any of that crap. I was sent to this hellhole for a reason, and that reason wasn't some mythical force of evil. But as I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It started with whispers. I'd heard them before, muffled voices coming from the halls outside my cell. I thought they were just the guards talking, or maybe other inmates whispering in the night. But tonight, the whispers felt closer, almost as if someone was right beside my bed, breathing heavily. I sat up, the cold concrete floor chilling my bare feet. My eyes strained against the dark, trying to make out any shapes, any movement. There was nothing, but I could feel it. The presence. I wasn't alone. I've been in this prison for over 5 years, long enough to know the ins and outs of the place. I knew who to avoid, who to trust, and where to keep my head down. But tonight, I was the one being hunted. It started a few months ago. There's a cell down the hall from mine, number 13. Everyone knows the story about that cell. It's cursed, they say. The place where the worst of the worst are kept. Those who've committed unspeakable crimes, murderers, rapists, drug lords, the scum of society. And there's a rumor, a dark, twisted rumor about what happens to the inmates who are held there. I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was just a story, like the others. We all have our tales, our legends to scare each other. But then I started to notice things. Strange things. Guards walking by that cell with nervous glances, always quickening their pace. Inmates who would refuse to even go near it, crossing themselves when they passed. It was like that cell had an aura of death around it. One night, I couldn't sleep. I was lying in my cot, trying to ignore the sounds of metal scraping against metal, the distant murmur of voices, when I heard a loud bang. It came from down the hall, from cell 13. I didn't think much of it at first, but then there were screams. Horrible, guttural screams that echoed through the prison like they were coming from the depths of hell itself. The kind of scream you hear in nightmares, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I heard shuffling, then another bang, and then silence. The next morning, the guards were acting strange. They wouldn't look at anyone in the eye, their faces pale as if they'd seen something that had shattered their souls. When I asked one of the inmates what happened, he just looked at me, wide-eyed, and said, "Don't ever talk about that place. It's cursed." I tried to let it go. I really did. But that night, I couldn't shake the thought. Something had happened in that cell. Something bad. And now it was like the entire prison was haunted by it. I tried to ignore the whispers that night, but they grew louder. I rolled over in my bed, pulling the thin blanket over my body, but the cold air seeped in anyway. I swear, the temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. It felt like something was crawling under my skin, sending chills down my spine. Then the door to my cell creaked open. I froze. No one ever came in at this time. The guards did their rounds every few hours, but never at midnight, and they never opened my cell unless it was for a scheduled check or meal. I didn't dare look. I could feel it, whatever it was, standing there in the doorway. The whispers were louder now, more urgent. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone of their voices was unmistakable. Angry, desperate. Something was wrong. I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor toward me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but my mouth felt like it was glued shut. I could feel the presence standing right next to my bed, breathing heavily, its cold breath washing over me like a gust of wind. It felt wrong. It felt like death. Then a voice, deep and guttural, spoke. "You don't belong here." It wasn't a voice I recognized. It didn't sound human. It was like something had crossed over from the other side, something trapped between worlds. The voice echoed in my mind, sending a wave of nausea through my stomach. "You're one of us now." The voice continued. "You'll never leave." I tried to shout, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. My arms felt like lead, my legs like stone. I was paralyzed. The air was thick now, heavier than it had been before. My vision blurred, and I could hear the sound of chains dragging across the floor like something was crawling toward me. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought to break free from whatever this was. And then I saw it. At the foot of my bed, a figure appeared. It was shadowy, shifting like smoke, but it had the unmistakable shape of a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. Its face was pale, like it had been drained of all color, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that sent shivers through my spine. I couldn't look away. "It's too late," the figure whispered, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "We've been waiting for you." Suddenly, the room grew darker, colder. I could see the figure's hands now, long fingers with sharp, elongated nails reaching out toward me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. I was frozen, my entire body screaming for release, but I couldn't escape. I could feel the figure's touch, cold and deathly, as it gripped my wrist with an unnatural strength. Its face came closer, its eyes boring into mine, and I saw something in them. Something old, something ancient, something that knew every dark secret I'd ever kept. I wasn't alone anymore. The shadows were moving, crawling across the walls, stretching toward me. I could hear them, their voices all around me now, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of terror that drove me to the edge of madness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness lifted. The figure was gone, the cold faded, the whispers stopped. I lay there, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. The room was still dark, the lights flickering back on, but it felt different. The silence was suffocating. I don't know how long I lay there, just staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I heard a noise, a door slamming somewhere down the hall, then another, and another. I wasn't sure if it was real or if I was losing my mind, but I could feel it. The prison was alive with something evil. The next morning, I was called into the warden's office. The guards were still acting strange, their faces pale and jittery. The warden didn't say much, just handed me a stack of papers. I didn't need to read them to know what they said. I knew the truth. Cell 13 had claimed another victim. The same victim who had screamed in the night. The same victim who had been dragged into that cursed cell and never seen again. I don't know what's waiting for me, but I know one thing. I can't leave. Once you're in this place, there's no way out. The walls, the bars, they're just the beginning. The real prison is the one you can't escape, the one inside your head. And as I sit here in my cell, I can hear the whispers again. They're getting closer.
Next story.
It was my third day in prison, and already I felt the weight of the place pressing down on me. They called it the House of Shadows, a prison built on the site of an old Civil War fort. You could feel the history in the air, thick, oppressive, like it had seeped into the very walls. The walls, I would soon realize, weren't just made of stone and steel. They were made of something darker. I had been arrested on a robbery charge, but I was innocent. That's what I told myself over and over. I had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and now I was trapped. I wasn't sure what was worse, the fear of the other prisoners, or the sense that something was wrong with the prison itself. The first night, I couldn't sleep. The place was too quiet, the kind of eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It was the silence of a place that had seen too much. I tried to brush it off, but then things started happening. At first, it was small, noises in the dead of night, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, scratching sounds in the walls, doors rattling when no one was near them. I thought it was just the usual paranoia, the fear that comes with being in a place like this. But when I woke up one morning and found a message scratched into the wall of my cell, I knew something wasn't right. The message read, "They're watching you." At first, I thought it was a prank, something one of the other inmates had done to mess with me. But as the days went on, the whispers grew louder. I began to see things too. Shadows flickering just out of the corner of my eye, faces that seemed to melt into the stone walls when I stared at them too long. I knew I wasn't going crazy. I wasn't imagining it. Something was in this prison. Something old, something vengeful. It wasn't long before I met one of the lifers who'd been there for decades. His name was Hank, and he'd been around long enough to know every inch of the prison's twisted history. One day during lunch, I asked him about the stories I'd heard, about the strange occurrences, the whispers, the feeling that the walls themselves were alive. Hank's face darkened. He looked around, making sure no one else was listening, and then leaned in close. "You don't know what kind of place you're in," he muttered. "This ain't just a prison. This is where souls go to die and never leave." I raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Hank swallowed his food and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "The place is cursed. This land, this fort, it was built on blood. There's a reason they called it the House of Shadows. It's not just a nickname. It's real." I laughed it off. "You believe in ghosts?" Hank's eyes were cold, his expression hardening. "I don't believe. I know. I've seen 'em. I've heard 'em." He paused, glancing over his shoulder. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice low. I strained to listen, but there was nothing, just the usual clatter of trays and voices in the cafeteria. "What?" Hank's lips tightened. "That's the sound of the dead walking these halls. They don't rest easy, not here. The place has a way of bringing out the worst in people." I didn't want to believe him, but the more I thought about it, the more his words seemed to make sense. The feeling of being watched, the strange noises, it all fit. But I wasn't sure if I could trust him. Hank was a lifer, and people like him often had their own way of looking at things. Later that night, as I lay in my cell trying to shut my mind off, I heard it again. The whispering. This time it was louder, clearer, as if someone was standing right next to me, speaking directly into my ear. "Help me." I jerked upright, heart racing. The air in the cell had turned colder, the chill biting into my skin. My breath came out in white puffs, even though it was warm outside. I tried to tell myself it was just the air conditioning, but I couldn't ignore the dread creeping up my spine. "Help me?" The voice was pleading, desperate. It sounded like it was coming from the walls, from the very foundation of the cell block. I stood up and walked over to the bars, pressing my ear against them, listening for any sound of movement. Nothing. Just the usual sounds of a prison at night, distant clanging, the hum of the ventilation system. Then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, near the entrance to the old part of the prison, the part they had shut off and abandoned long ago, I saw a figure. It was tall, dark, and seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like a shadow that didn't belong. It was standing perfectly still, watching me. I froze, my heart pounding. It didn't move, it didn't speak, it just stood there, watching. I didn't know what to do. Should I scream for the guards? Should I run? But my legs wouldn't move. It felt like the air had thickened around me, pressing me into place. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, swallowed by the darkness of the old wing. I didn't sleep that night, and I didn't sleep for many nights after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming for me. Something older than the prison itself. Hank's words echoed in my mind. The place has a way of bringing out the worst in people. I knew that he wasn't just talking about the other inmates. The place itself was evil, feeding off the fear and guilt of everyone inside. The next day, I tried to talk to Hank again, but when I went to his cell, he wasn't there. I asked around, but no one had seen him. It was like he had vanished, just like the figure in the hallway. By then, I was starting to lose my grip on reality. The whispers never stopped. They came at all hours of the day and night. I couldn't tell if they were real or just in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the walls were closing in on me. And then one night, it happened. I woke up to the sound of someone crying. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, more frantic. The sound came from the cell next to mine, the one that had been empty for weeks. I had never heard anyone move in or out, and I was certain no one had been assigned to it. But tonight, it was occupied. I stood up, my body trembling as I approached the bars. I looked into the empty cell, but there was no one there. Only the same dark shadows that seemed to cling to the corners of the room. Then I saw it. A hand, a pale, bony hand, reached out from the shadows, gripping the bars. I could see the veins, the fingers long and twisted like claws. The hand was covered in something black, something wet. And then from the darkness, a face emerged. It wasn't human. It was something twisted, something not right. The eyes were hollow, and the skin was stretched tight over the bones, a grotesque mask of death. It grinned at me, a horrible, jagged grin that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. But the thing in the cell didn't move. It just stared, its grin growing wider with every second. That was the last night I spent in that cell. The next morning, I was moved to a different part of the prison, away from the old section. But I knew it didn't matter. It wasn't the cell that was haunted, it was the entire prison. The ghosts of the past had taken hold of the place, and no one, not even the living, could escape them. I'm still here, still trapped in this place. The whispers never stop, the shadows never go away. I've learned one thing: the dead never rest. They are always watching, always waiting for their next victim. And one day, they'll come for me.
Next story.
I had always heard whispers about the old prison. People said it was haunted, that the spirits of the men who had died there roamed the halls, still trapped by the walls they'd once lived behind. But I never really believed it, until I found myself stuck in there. I'm not proud of the choices that led to my incarceration, but life had taken me down a dark path, and I ended up in one of the most notorious prisons in the state. The place had a reputation. They called it The Rock. No one came out the same. Some didn't come out at all. My first night there, I couldn't sleep. The cell was small, dark, and smelled like mold and rot. The concrete walls seemed to close in on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The guards had warned me that the old building was full of history that wasn't all good. As I lay on the thin mattress, the echo of distant whispers slithered through the air, making my skin crawl. I figured it was just my mind playing tricks on me, trying to adjust to the place. But the next night, I heard it again. Only this time, it was clearer. It was like a low murmur, voices mixed with the sound of chains dragging across the floor. It sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to ignore it, but then it happened again the night after, and again, and again. One evening, while the other inmates were trying to sleep, I decided to investigate. I slipped out of my cell, careful not to make a sound. The corridors were dark, the only light coming from the flickering overhead bulbs. I crept down the hall, past the old cells where the other prisoners slept fitfully. The murmur grew louder the further I went. It seemed to come from the depths of the prison, from an area that was no longer used. I reached a part of the building that was off limits to us. The guards had told us that it was condemned, that no one had been down there in years. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to go. My curiosity gnawed at me, so I pried open a rusted door and stepped into the darkness. The air was thick and cold, and my breath came out in clouds. It smelled like decay, a sharp, acrid odor that made my stomach churn. The only sound was the echo of my footsteps on the cracked concrete floor. But then I heard it. A soft scraping noise, like metal dragging across stone. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, my eyes straining to make out shapes in the gloom. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall, almost skeletal, its features hidden in the darkness. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to grow colder, heavier. I could hear its ragged breathing like a ghost trying to claw its way back from the afterlife. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, I forced myself to turn and run. My feet pounded against the floor as I sprinted back toward the safety of my cell, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. I could still feel the presence of that thing following me, even though I didn't dare look back. When I made it back to my cell, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I huddled in the corner, shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. The next few days were a blur. I tried to go about my daily routine, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They came at night, when the other prisoners were asleep, when the guards weren't around. And they weren't just voices anymore. They were screams, agonized, tortured cries that seemed to come from deep within the walls. I could hear them in my cell, in the hallway, even in the showers. It was as if the whole place was alive, suffocating under the weight of its own dark history. I started seeing things too. At first, it was just fleeting glimpses, shadows moving in the corners of my eyes, figures standing just out of sight. But soon, the apparitions grew clearer. I saw the faces of men who had died in this prison, their eyes hollow and empty, their mouths twisted in pain. They would stare at me from the walls, from the floors, from the ceiling, their hands reaching out as if to grab me. Every time I turned around, they were closer, inching their way toward me. I couldn't take it anymore. I was losing my mind. I started talking to myself, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was just hallucinating from the isolation and the stress. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The spirits of this place were real, and they weren't done with me. One night, I was woken up by a loud banging noise. It was coming from the wall behind my bed. I jumped to my feet, my heart racing, and pressed my ear against the cold concrete. The sound was like someone pounding on the wall from the other side, begging to be let out. I could feel the vibrations in my chest, like the wall itself was alive. And then I heard it. A voice, faint at first but growing stronger. It was a whisper, a voice filled with malice and rage. "Help me," it said, its tone hoarse and pleading. "You shouldn't be here, but if they will take you too." I pulled away from the wall, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The voice grew louder, angrier. "Get out," it screamed. "Leave before it's too late." I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should run or if I should try to fight it. But one thing was clear. This place, this prison, was more than just a building. It was a tomb, a place where souls were trapped for eternity, unable to move on. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in the corner of my cell, wide-eyed, listening to the sounds of the prison. The whispers, the banging, the screams. They never stopped. And every time I thought I could ignore it, I saw the figures again. They were there, standing at the edge of my vision, watching me. By morning, I was a wreck. I couldn't eat. I couldn't focus. I was losing my grip on reality. The guards noticed, of course. They saw the fear in my eyes, the tremors in my hands. They called for the doctor, but the doctor only confirmed what I already knew. I was fine physically. But mentally, something had broken inside me. I didn't care what the doctor said. I knew the truth. The prison wasn't just a place for criminals. It was a place for the dead, for the souls of the men who had been trapped here, and they weren't going to let me leave. I had heard stories of inmates who had gone mad, who had disappeared without a trace. I knew they hadn't escaped. They'd been claimed by the prison. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for whatever was coming for me. I wasn't going to let this place swallow me whole. So I did what I thought was my only chance. When the guards made their rounds, I slipped out of my cell once again. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away from those voices, those spirits. I ran through the dark hallways, my footsteps echoing off the cold stone. I didn't know if I was heading toward freedom or toward my doom, but I had to try. I reached the gates, only to find them locked. The shadows moved around me, closing in. And then from the darkness, I heard that voice again, the one that had haunted me since my first night here. "You should have listened," it whispered. "Now you're ours." The door slammed shut in my face, and the darkness consumed me.
Next story.
I had been inside for a little over 2 years when it all started. I was doing time for something I didn't even commit, and I didn't know how much longer I could take it. There was a sense of hopelessness that had settled in deep, weighing down on me. I was just going through the motions. Wake up, eat, work, sleep, repeat. And I didn't have anyone left to talk to. My family had long since given up on me, and the few friends I had made in here had either been transferred to other prisons or just disappeared altogether. The guards? They weren't much better. Most of them were indifferent at best, sadistic at worst. But one, Officer Miller, caught my attention from the start. He was different. He was always watching, never speaking unless he had to, and his eyes, they were unsettling. There was something about them, like they could see right through you, like he knew your darkest secrets without you ever saying a word. I remember the first time I noticed something odd. It was late at night, and I was lying in my cot trying to fall asleep. I could hear the usual sounds of the prison. Doors creaking, distant shouting, the clinking of metal against metal. But there was something else. A sound that was hard to explain, like a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere deep within the walls. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just the building settling, or maybe a rat gnawing at the pipes. But the sound was persistent, growing louder and more menacing as the night wore on. Then I heard something even stranger. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the hallway. I lay still, holding my breath, trying to make sense of what was going on. The footsteps stopped right outside my cell. I couldn't see anything through the small barred window, but I could feel someone standing there, watching me. I sat up, heart racing. The door to my cell didn't open, but I swear I heard something or someone whispering my name faintly as if it was carried on the wind. It was just barely audible, but the sound made my blood run cold. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that it was just my imagination, but I couldn't. The next morning, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I was just stressed out. The isolation, the endless days of monotony. Maybe it was all getting to me. But the next few nights, the strange occurrences continued. The whispers, the growls, the footsteps outside my door. It was like I was being stalked by some unseen force, something that knew me and was waiting for the right moment to strike. I had to talk to someone about it, but who could I trust? The guards? They would think I was crazy. The other inmates? They were all wrapped up in their own survival games. But there was one man who seemed to know more about this place than anyone else. Old Man Watkins. He was a lifer, had been here for decades, and he wasn't the type to talk about his past. But I had overheard him talking to a few other inmates once, telling them about the thing in the walls. They laughed it off, but I saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't a joke. One day, I found him sitting by himself in the yard, staring off into the distance. I approached him cautiously, not sure what to say. "You believe in ghosts?" I asked. Watkins looked at me, his eyes cold and knowing. "Ghosts? No. What's in these walls is much worse than that." I raised an eyebrow, not sure if I was ready to hear what he was about to say, but I pressed on. "What do you mean?" He let out a long, drawn-out sigh and glanced around, making sure no one was listening. Then, in a low voice, he began to speak. Back when this place was first built, they didn't just lock up criminals. They locked up something else too. Something they couldn't control. Something. Evil. Evil. He paused, his eyes flicking nervously to the prison walls as if to make sure they weren't listening. "It's been here for years, lurking in the darkness. People say it's what makes the prisoners go mad, what drives them to do things they'd never do in the outside world." I could feel a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean? Evil?" "It's hard to explain," he continued. "But there's something about the prison itself, the foundation, the layout. The original architects, they were into some dark stuff. They didn't just build this place to hold people. They built it to trap something much worse than just criminals." I wasn't sure whether to believe him, but something about his tone told me he wasn't lying. There was fear in his voice, a deep, primal fear. "Do you think it's still here?" I asked. Watkins nodded gravely. "It never left. It's always been here, feeding off the fear and misery of the people who come through these gates. It knows you. It watches you. And one day, it will come for you." I didn't know how to respond. I had heard rumors over the years, stories from the older prisoners about strange noises, voices in the dark, the feeling of being watched, but I always dismissed them as just that, stories. Tall tales to scare the new guys. But after everything I had been experiencing, I started to wonder if there was some truth to it. That night, everything escalated. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my cell door rattling. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. The growling was back, louder this time, as if it was right outside my door, waiting for me. But I couldn't see anything. I strained my ears, trying to hear any movement, but it was just the growls and then the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, closer. My door flew open. I couldn't explain it. I don't know how it happened, but I was standing in the middle of my cell and there was something. No, someone standing in the doorway. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow, its features hidden. I could feel its presence, its malice, like it was a part of the prison itself. Before I could scream, it reached out, its hand grabbing me by the throat, lifting me off the ground with an unnatural strength. My vision blurred as I gasped for air, and in that moment, I knew I wasn't dealing with any normal ghost or spirit. This was something much darker. The whispers filled my ears, but they weren't just whispers anymore. They were voices, taunting me, telling me my darkest fears, my deepest regrets. I tried to struggle, but it was no use. I was trapped. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, my heart racing. When I looked up, the figure was gone, and the cell door was closed again. I never spoke to anyone about it. Who would believe me? I had learned to keep my mouth shut. But from that night on, I could feel it, the presence, watching me, always watching, waiting for me to slip, to fall. I don't know if I'll make it out of here. I don't know if anyone ever does. But I do know one thing. Whatever is inside this prison, it's not just the walls that are holding us in. It's something far darker, and it's coming for me.
Next story.
I was young when I was first arrested. A mistake, a stupid choice, and now I was locked up. The first night in that place was the worst. I remember the sound of the cell doors slamming shut like a final warning. The smell of sweat, old food, and fear filled the air. But the worst part wasn't the noise, the smells, or the cold. It was the feeling, like something was watching me. I wasn't alone in the cell. There was an older guy named Clyde. He'd been here for years, so he knew the ropes. He was quiet, but whenever I'd try to sleep, I'd catch him staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. It unnerved me, but I didn't dare say anything. I didn't know if he was just crazy or if there was something wrong with him, or both. That night, after the lights went out, the air seemed to change. I remember shivering, even though the cell was stuffy and warm. I tried to sleep, but something made my skin crawl. At first, I thought it was just the place messing with my head, but then I heard the whispers, low, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. At first, I thought it was just other prisoners talking, but when I listened closely, I realized no one else was awake. The whispers were right there in the corners of the room, just beyond my reach. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to hear anymore, but I had no choice. I turned to Clyde, but his eyes were wide open, locked onto the wall. "You hear that?" I asked him, my voice shaky. Clyde didn't respond, didn't even move. He just stared, almost like he was frozen. His lips were parted, as though he was listening too. I followed his gaze to the wall, but all I saw was the cracked cement. The whispers grew louder. I couldn't make out the words, but they were cold, like something ancient and angry, lingering just beyond the surface. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, but the whispers didn't stop. It was like they were crawling under my skin, burrowing into my brain. Every time I closed my eyes, they followed, the same low, growling whispers that seemed to be getting closer. The next morning, Clyde was different. His usual quiet demeanor was gone. He was jittery, his hands shaking, his eyes wild. He wouldn't look at me. When I asked him what was wrong, he snapped, "You're going to hear it too. It's not just you. It's all of us. All of us." I didn't understand what he meant, but as the days went on, I started to feel it too. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Sometimes I'd wake up to find scratches on the walls, long and deep, like something had been trying to claw its way through. But it wasn't just the walls that were moving. The floor, the ceiling, they all seemed to shift, like the whole building was alive. It wasn't long before I started to see things. At first, I thought it was just sleep deprivation, the result of the endless nights and constant fear. But it wasn't. It was real. There was a shadow, tall and thin, always standing in the corner of my cell. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but every time I blinked, the shadow was still there, watching me. Sometimes it would move, just out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, it was gone. One night, as I lay there trembling, I saw it. The shadow didn't stay in the corner anymore. It moved across the cell, its long, spindly limbs stretching out like they were made of smoke. I heard its whisper then, clear as day. It wasn't in the walls anymore, it was in my mind. "Leave," it said, its voice like dry leaves crunching underfoot. "Leave before it's too late." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, but my body was frozen. Then I felt it. Cold fingers brushing my skin, icy and sharp, like the touch of a dead man. I opened my eyes, but there was nothing there. Nothing except for the shadow, standing right at the foot of my bed, staring down at me. I screamed. I don't even know how it happened, but somehow I screamed. And then it was gone. Just like that. The shadow, the whispers, everything. The room was quiet again. Too quiet. Clyde was gone the next morning. His bed was empty, the sheets rumpled like he had been there but never left. The guards came by, muttering something about him being transferred to another unit. But something about the way they looked at me told me they knew more than they were saying. Weeks went by and the shadow stayed. It was always there, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. The whispers were louder now, more urgent. I could hear them even when the lights were on, even when I was surrounded by other inmates. They never stopped. They never gave me peace. Then it happened. I was in the yard, just trying to get some fresh air when I saw it. a figure standing by the fence, watching me. It was Clyde. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, like something had sucked the life right out of him. I called his name, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes. I ran toward him, but when I got close, I froze. There was something wrong about him. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his body swayed like it wasn't even connected to the ground. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, and then, in a voice that wasn't his own, I heard it. "He's here. We all are. He never left." I stumbled back, my heart racing, my chest tight with fear. That was the last time I saw Clyde. The last time I saw anyone from the unit. The next morning, they told me he'd escaped. That was the official story, but I knew the truth. Clyde didn't escape. He had become something else, something that roamed the halls waiting for the next soul to claim. The whispers grew louder, and I couldn't take it anymore. I needed out. I needed to leave. I don't care how. I just needed to get away from that place. From those walls that weren't just stone, but something darker. Something that fed on fear. I didn't care if I had to crawl out with my bare hands. I was going to escape, even if it meant losing my mind. But when I tried to leave, the guards wouldn't let me. The doors were locked, but I knew it didn't matter. It wasn't the door that kept me in, it was the prison itself. It was the thing that had been waiting all these years, waiting for souls like mine to wander in, lost and alone. I heard the whispers again, louder now. There was no escape. Not for me, not for anyone who had set foot in that place. The walls were alive with something evil, something that could never be put to rest. And then I heard Clyde's voice, faint but unmistakable. "Stay with us." The shadow was back, standing at the edge of my cell, waiting. I didn't scream this time, I didn't run. I just let it take me, because I knew deep down I would never leave.
Next story.
I had been in this hellhole for nearly 4 years, but the thing that happened to me, it changed everything. No one ever talks about what goes on behind these walls. Well, no one who's still sane anyway. Most of the guys here are just trying to get by, survive the routine, keep their heads down. You know the drill. But some of us, we see things you can't explain. I'll start by saying this. The prison I'm in isn't just any old place. It's old, real old. I've heard the rumors. This place was built a century ago, on top of land that was supposedly cursed. Some of the lifers swear that the land itself holds memories, bad ones, and that the ghosts of the past never really left. I always laughed it off. Ghosts? In prison? Please. I was too busy trying to figure out how to survive to worry about things like that. But that all changed one night. It all started when they brought in a new inmate, Carter. He was different from the others, the kind of guy who immediately attracts attention. Big guy, intense eyes. Even the guards seemed a little uneasy around him. At first, I thought he was just a big shot, someone who had a reputation on the outside and wanted to keep that up in here. But soon enough, I realized Carter wasn't like the other guys. He wasn't just tough. There was something wrong with him. It was on the second night he was locked up in the cell next to mine that I first heard it. That noise. At first, it was faint. Just a tapping, like someone was tapping their fingers on the metal bars. I assumed it was Carter, maybe trying to get my attention. The tapping grew louder, faster, like he was knocking, but with more force, more urgency. I thought he was going nuts, but then I heard something else. A low whispering, barely audible but unmistakable. It was coming from Carter's cell, but there was no one else in there. Just him. The whispers, they weren't in any language I recognized. They didn't sound human. It was more like breathing, like the wind was carrying voices that weren't meant for this world. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. Every night it would get worse. The tapping, the whispering. Then one night it got violent. The noise turned into banging, slamming, something being thrown against the walls. I could hear Carter yelling too, but his voice didn't sound right. It sounded distorted, like he was being choked. Then there was silence. When the guards finally came to check on him the next morning, Carter was unrecognizable. His face was pale, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, but there was no life in them. He was sitting on the floor of his cell, his back pressed against the wall, hands clutching his chest. He didn't speak, didn't move. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw something terrifying that I couldn't shake off. He was gone. Not dead, but gone. His body was there, but his soul, it wasn't. The The guards moved him out that morning, but the whispers didn't stop. They stayed, in the walls, in the air. I swear I could hear them, echoing through the halls every night. It was like the building itself had come alive, feeding on the fear, on the pain of the people who were trapped here. A week later, another inmate, Ricky, started acting strange. Ricky was a lifer, a guy who had been in here longer than anyone, but he wasn't crazy. He had this look in his eyes, though, like he was seeing things that weren't there. He'd sit in his cell and just stare at the wall, muttering to himself. I tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't respond. Then, one night, he snapped. I was asleep when I heard the screaming. It was Ricky's voice, high-pitched and frantic. He was shouting, begging someone to leave him alone. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding, and rushed to the bars of my cell. The other inmates were doing the same, looking out of their cells to see what was going on. But when I saw Ricky, it froze me. He was standing in the middle of his cell, eyes wide, hands shaking. He was backing up against the wall, looking over his shoulder like something was chasing him. His skin was pale, his breath ragged. He looked terrified. "Get it off me! Get it off me!" He screamed, scratching at his arms like something invisible was attacking him. But there was nothing there. The guards rushed in and subdued him, but he wasn't the same after that. They took him to the infirmary, but when they brought him back a few days later, he wasn't talking. He just stared into space, unblinking, like he was lost. They kept him isolated, and after that, no one really spoke to him. But the whispers kept coming, and they kept getting louder. I don't know how to explain it, but after a while, I began hearing things too. It was like the voices weren't just coming from one cell or one inmate anymore. They were everywhere, slithering through the cracks in the walls, floating down the corridors, filling the spaces between breaths. I'd hear my name called, faintly, from the other end of the hallway, or I'd hear the sound of footsteps echoing when no one was there. I tried to keep it together, but it was starting to eat away at me. The guards were getting more nervous, too. Some of them started calling in sick, saying they couldn't handle the atmosphere in the prison anymore. There were rumors, too. Rumors that the warden had known about this place's history, but had kept quiet. That the land it was built on was cursed long before anyone ever set foot in here. Then, it happened to me. It was late, and I had just finished my last meal of the day. I was lying in my cot, trying to block out the whispers that had begun to haunt me, when I heard it. The tapping, soft, like nails on metal. But this time, it was in my cell. No one was around. I froze. I could hear it moving closer, tapping its way down the metal bars of my cell door. I tried to scream, but my throat felt tight, like something was pressing down on it. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were calling my name. I scrambled to get up, but before I could reach the door, I saw something. A figure, standing just inside the shadows. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel it. It wasn't human. It was something ancient, something hungry. "Leave me alone," I whispered, backing up into the corner of my cell. But it wasn't enough. The figure moved closer, and that's when I saw its eyes, black, voids that seemed to absorb everything around them. I closed my eyes, tried to block it out, but the voices were inside my head now. They were everywhere, urging me, pulling me down into the darkness. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold concrete floor of my cell. The figure was gone, but the whispers remained, and now they were inside me too. They said, "You'll never leave." And I know they're right. No one does. Once you're here, it's only a matter of time before you lose yourself to the prison, and something else comes for you.
Next story.
I was barely 20 when I ended up in that place. Just a kid caught up in a wrong turn, paying for a stupid mistake. But as soon as the gate slammed shut behind me, I knew that I was going to regret it for the rest of my life. Not because of the violence or the tension between the inmates. No, it was the silence that chilled me to my bones. It was a max security prison, the kind that swallowed people whole, and I wasn't built for it. The guards had that look in their eyes, like they'd seen it all and didn't care anymore. The other prisoners didn't speak much, their eyes always darting around, always watching, always waiting. They threw me into a cell with a guy named Mike. He had been in there longer than anyone could remember, and if you believe the rumors, he was one of the most dangerous men in the prison. He had a reputation for being odd, but by the time I got there, his reputation was just another story you heard from the old-timers. He had this strange calm about him, like nothing ever bothered him. But there was something else, something unsettling in the way he stared at the walls. It was like he could see something that I couldn't. I thought it was just his mind gone from years of incarceration. But I was wrong. The first night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't the clanging of the doors or the shouting in the hallways. It was the silence again. I could feel it pressing in on me, like the walls were too close. My skin felt too tight, and there were these sounds. At first, I thought I was hearing things. Scraping noises, something sliding across the floor. I told myself it was just the building settling, old pipes or something. But as the hours dragged on, I realized it wasn't just the sound. It was the feeling. Like something was moving under the floor, crawling just beneath the surface. I glanced over at Mike, but he was staring straight ahead, his hands folded in his lap. Not a muscle moved. I called out to him, "Mike, you hearing this?" He didn't respond, didn't even blink. So I did the only thing I could do. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. But the sounds wouldn't stop, scratching, shuffling, and then a low, dragging noise like something heavy was being pulled through the concrete. I felt my heart racing. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick and hard to breathe. Suddenly, I couldn't ignore it anymore. There was something in the room with us. I opened my eyes, and that's when I saw it, just for a split second, right above Mike's head, an outline in the dark. A figure. It was tall, almost impossibly tall, and it seemed to sway like it was moving in and out of the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. I sat up, sweating. My pulse thudded in my chest. I looked at Mike again, and this time he was still staring ahead, but his lips were moving. Quiet at first, then louder. His words weren't clear, but they sounded like whispers. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but they were words, that much I knew. "Mike," I asked, my voice shaky, "what are you saying?" He didn't answer, just kept muttering under his breath. But then his eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked afraid. "You hear it too, don't you?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. I nodded slowly. "What is it?" He leaned forward, his face inches from mine. "It's the thing in the walls. It's been here longer than the building. It feeds off fear, off souls." I laughed nervously, thinking it was just another crazy story. But Mike's face didn't change. He wasn't joking. "You hear it at night," he continued. "The scraping, the dragging, it's trying to get out. And once it gets to you, once it touches you, you're done. It doesn't matter how tough you are. You'll never leave." I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't lying. But I tried to dismiss it. I tried to focus on something else, anything else, to block out the fear gnawing at my insides. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't even close my eyes without hearing it, scraping, sliding, dragging. The sounds came from all directions, like they were closing in. I pulled the blankets up over my head, but it didn't help. The noise kept getting closer. Then the door to the cell creaked open. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. I heard footsteps, heavy, dragging across the floor, and then a low, guttural voice, not from Mike, but from somewhere in the darkness. "Join us." I was too terrified to move. The footsteps grew louder, like something was coming closer, just beyond my reach. My body trembled with fear, but I couldn't scream. I couldn't even breathe. The sound grew louder, a scraping sound like nails on metal echoing off the walls. And then I saw it again. The figure. It was taller than before, looming just outside my cell. It was transparent, almost ghostly, but I could see it clearly, just standing there, watching me. Its eyes, I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, staring into me, past me. And then it spoke again. The voice not a whisper, but a harsh, rasping sound. "Join us." Mike stirred beside me, his eyes wide open, and for the first time, I saw the same fear I felt reflected in his face. He wasn't calm anymore. He wasn't the Mike I had met when I first arrived. He was different. "It's too late for me," Mike said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's been here for years. They never leave, and neither will we." I tried to get up, but my body wouldn't respond. My legs wouldn't move. The figure outside the cell was closer now. I could see its shape shifting in the darkness, its outline undulating like smoke. It was real. It wasn't a dream. It was coming for me. I heard the scraping again, but this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from within the floor, beneath the concrete, crawling closer to me, pulling itself up from the depths. "Join us," it hissed again. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I tried to crawl toward the bars to escape, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't obey. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the figure was standing right in front of me now, its form solidifying, its presence overwhelming. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The scraping stopped, the whispering stopped, and the room fell into an eerie silence. I don't remember how long I stayed like that. I don't remember how I got to sleep. But when I woke up, Mike was gone. Completely gone. The bed was empty, the cell untouched. No one knew what happened to him. They said he had been transferred, but I knew the truth. It's been months since then. I'm still here, still locked in this cell. And every night the scraping returns and I hear the whispers. They're getting closer.
Next story.
I'll never forget the day I walked into that prison. I wasn't a lifer, just a guy who made a mistake. One bad decision that cost me my freedom. But the second I set foot inside, I realized this place wasn't just a prison. It was something much darker. No one told me the stories, but I could feel it. Something was wrong, something I couldn't see, but I could definitely sense. I was placed in a cell with a guy named Rick. He was quiet, kept to himself, but there was something about him that unsettled me. Every time I tried to talk to him, he just stared ahead, like he couldn't hear me. I chalked it up to him being a lifer, but deep down, I knew it was something else. The first night in my new cell, I woke up to a strange sound, a tapping. It started out soft, like something faintly drumming against the walls. At first, I thought it was just the pipes or something, but the tapping grew louder, more rhythmic. I looked at Rick, expecting him to be awake, but he was lying there, eyes wide open, staring at the wall. "Rick?" I whispered. He didn't move. The tapping continued. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it wouldn't stop. I buried my head in the pillow, trying to shut it out, but the tapping was relentless, almost as if something was trying to get through the wall. Then I heard it, the faintest whisper, like a breath against my ear. "Leave now." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. There was no one else in the cell, just Rick and me. The whisper came again, sharper this time. "Leave now, before it's too late." I sat up, my eyes darting around the small, dimly lit room. Nothing. Nothing but the tapping. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I felt like I was suffocating. I shook Rick's shoulder. "Rick, wake up!" But he didn't respond. It was like he was in a trance, his eyes still staring, unblinking at the wall. I looked back at the wall where the tapping had been coming from, and I saw it, faint, almost imperceptible, like a shadow moving just beneath the surface of the concrete. It was crawling, stretching like something was trying to break free. I was about to scream, but then a loud bang echoed through the cell. The sound was so deafening, it made my ears ring. I spun around to see Rick finally move, but not in a way that made sense. His head tilted to one side unnaturally, and he let out a guttural sound, something between a growl and a moan. "Rick, what the hell, man?" I stammered, backing away. But his eyes, they weren't Rick's eyes anymore. They were empty, hollow, black as night. He opened his mouth, but instead of words, a voice, deep, gravely and ancient, spoke. "You're in our place now. We all belong here, forever." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I could only hear the tapping, louder now, all around me, inside my skull. Then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The tapping, the whispering. Rick fell silent again, his head slumping forward as if he had returned to his original position. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat up, watching Rick, listening to the silence. But it wasn't real silence. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, suffocating, making every breath feel like a struggle. The kind of silence that promises something terrible is about to happen. Morning came and the guards came for Rick. They'd come to take him to his daily work assignment, but when they opened the cell, they froze. Rick was gone. Just gone. No sign of him. The bed was undisturbed, but there was no trace of him anywhere. I told them what happened. I told them about the tapping, the whispers, the black eyes. They didn't believe me. They thought I was just another scared rookie, trying to make sense of a new, brutal life behind bars. They told me it was all in my head, but I knew the truth. Something had taken Rick, and it wasn't done. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to push the memory of that night out of my mind, but the whispers didn't let me. They grew louder, more insistent. Every night, they were there, crawling beneath the walls, slithering in the shadows. I couldn't escape them. And as the days passed, I realized something even worse. The more I heard them, the more I saw things, things that weren't there. Shadows shifting in the corners of my cell, the sounds of chains dragging against the floor, low, anguished wails coming from the darkness. And it wasn't just me. The other inmates began to act strange. They'd hear things too. One by one, they started disappearing. The guards were baffled. No one could explain it, but we all knew. We were being taken, pulled into whatever dark force haunted that place. It wasn't until my third week in that cell that I saw it. Actually saw it. It was late, the lights flickering above me. I was lying there trying to ignore the whispers when the temperature in the room dropped, so suddenly I could see my breath. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway of my cell. It was tall, thin, and covered in shadows. Its face, if you could call it a face, was twisted, like it was constantly shifting, unable to settle on one form. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel it staring right through me. The tapping had returned, louder than ever. It was coming from the walls, but also from the figure. "Come to us," it said, its voice echoing in my mind. I froze. I couldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I heard the unmistakable sound of chains dragging across the floor. The whispers were deafening now, 1,000 voices all demanding something from me, something I wasn't willing to give. My legs finally responded, and I bolted out of the cell. I didn't care what the guards thought. I didn't care if they tried to stop me. I was going to get out of that hellhole, even if it meant jumping the fence, even if it meant running straight into the wilderness. But when I reached the yard, something was wrong. The prison gates, the walls, everything had disappeared. All that was left was endless darkness. The whispers were louder now, and the tapping was everywhere. That's when I realized I wasn't in a prison anymore. I was in a trap, a place where souls were lost, where the walls were alive and the shadows never let go. And the worst part, I knew I would never leave.
Next story.
It was my second week in the prison, and I was already starting to realize how different this place was from what I had imagined. The steel bars, the guards, the hardened criminals, all of that was just part of the show. What nobody told me about was the strange happenings, the weird occurrences that lingered in the shadows. I was assigned to the lower tier, a section of the prison where the cells were older, darker, and not maintained as well as the rest of the facility. The inmates here were mostly lifers, people who had been in for decades. They were quiet, too quiet. They never looked you in the eye. They never made conversation. Most of the time, they stared at the walls, barely acknowledging the world around them. It was on my second night when I started noticing something. At first, it was just the usual sounds, the clanking of metal doors, the distant shouts of the guards, and the hum of the overhead lights. But then I began to hear something else, something I couldn't explain. A tapping. Soft at first, like nails scratching against metal, but then it grew louder, rhythmic, like something or someone was tapping on the bars of my cell. I was alone in my cell. There was no one on my tier that I could talk to, no one I felt safe talking to, so I just lay there in the dark, trying to ignore it. But the tapping wouldn't stop. It echoed through the small space, getting louder and louder until it felt like it was coming from right beside me. I jumped out of bed, heart racing, and rushed to the bars. But there was nothing. Just the same empty hallway outside my cell, dimly lit by the flickering lights. I stood there for a moment, listening. The tapping was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe the building settling. After all, this place was old, probably as old as the inmates who lived in it. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next day, I met Eddie. He was the guy in the cell next to mine, a small, wiry man with a sharp face that looked like it had seen too much. He was the first person who actually spoke to me in the prison, even if it was just to ask me for a pack of cigarettes. But the conversation quickly shifted to something more disturbing. "You hear the tapping?" Eddie asked, his voice low, almost like he was afraid to be heard. I nodded, not sure if I should say anything. Eddie leaned closer to the bars of his cell. "It's not just you. It's been happening for years, ever since they locked that guy away in the isolation chamber." "The isolation chamber?" I asked, confused. Eddie glanced over his shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "You don't know about it? The old block. They put him down there, way back in the 80s. A man named Henry Walker. He was a killer, sure. But that's not the point. The point is, something happened down there. Something that shouldn't have. And ever since, there's been this tapping. I didn't know what to make of it. I thought Eddie was just telling one of those prison stories, wild rumors that get passed down over time. But his eyes were wide, and there was a tremble in his voice. Stay away from the lower tiers at night, Eddie warned me. Especially if you hear the tapping. You don't want to see what's down there. Trust me. I didn't know if I believed him, but something about the way he said it made me uneasy. That night, the tapping came again, louder than before, as if it was right outside my cell. I lay there in my bunk, not daring to move, my mind racing. Every part of me screamed to get up and check, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by the fear that if I stepped outside the safety of my cell, I'd see something I wasn't supposed to see. And then, through the crack in my door, I saw it, a shadow shifting just beyond my reach. I didn't know if it was real or if I was just losing my mind, but it was there. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure, tall and thin, moving like it was walking just out of the corner of my eye. The tapping grew louder, and I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped up, grabbed the bars, and pressed my face against the cold metal. I had to know what was causing it. The hallway outside my cell was empty. But then I heard it, closer now, right behind me, a soft, raspy breath, and then the whisper, "Help me." I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. No one. The hallway was still. I stood there for a long time, just breathing, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I heard it, louder than ever, the sound of footsteps dragging across the floor, slowly, deliberately. The noise grew closer, closer, until I could feel it, right at the edge of my cell. The door to my cell was locked. I was safe, I told myself, but the footsteps kept coming. I was frozen, unable to move, as the figure from the corner of my eye appeared again, right outside the bars. I didn't see a face, not exactly. It was more like a shadow that didn't belong, shifting in the dim light. But it had a presence, something dark, something wrong. It wasn't human. It was something else. The tapping began again, louder now, almost frantic. I slammed my hand against the bars and shouted for help, but no one came. "Please help me," I whispered. The figure was standing just beyond the bars now, its shape undulating, shifting like it was made of smoke. It didn't speak, but I could hear it in my mind, its voice, low and cruel. "You shouldn't be here." And then, just like that, it was gone. I don't remember much after that. I don't remember how I got back to bed or when I fell asleep, but the tapping never stopped. It echoed in my mind for days, and every night I could feel it, the presence, watching, waiting. I knew it was still there. Eddie didn't speak to me the next day, and when I asked about the isolation chamber, the guards told me it was a myth, that Henry Walker had died years ago, long before I'd ever set foot in the prison. But I didn't believe them. I knew the tapping, I knew the shadows, and I knew the truth. Some things in that prison were better left undisturbed. Some things should never be questioned, but I did, and now I'm paying the price.
Next story.
It was just another ordinary day, or so I thought. The kind of day where nothing out of the ordinary happens. The kind of day where the repetitive hum of prison life drowns out any thoughts of escape, any thoughts of freedom. It was just the clock ticking, guards making their rounds, and the faint murmur of inmates talking in the distance. But then, it happened. A shift in the air, as though the world around me suddenly grew colder. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had learned to ignore the little things, the random creaks of old decaying walls, the occasional drafts that would send a shiver down my spine, but this felt different. The incident started when they moved a new inmate into the cell next to mine. Normally, I would have paid no mind to it. We all rotated through here, and I'd been in solitary confinement for a while. Inmates came and went, but there was something about this one. Something strange. His name was Ethan. He was quiet. Too quiet. At first, I thought it was just the shock of being in prison for the first time. Everyone's like that when they first arrive, trying to figure out what the hell's going on in here. But Ethan was different. He didn't make a single sound when the guards locked him in. No protest, no shouting, just silence. I didn't think much of it at first. But that night, as I lay in my cot staring at the concrete ceiling, I heard something strange, a soft scratching noise. I didn't immediately connect it to Ethan's cell. It could have been rats or the wind shifting in the walls, but the noise persisted, growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't the kind of noise you'd expect in a prison. It sounded like someone or something was trying to claw its way out from behind the walls. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the next day, the guards were on edge. They kept whispering to each other, casting nervous glances at Ethan's cell as they passed. There was talk about a strange occurrence. No one was willing to speak openly about it, but there was something unsettling in the air. Everyone had a different story, a different version of what had happened, but the details didn't match up. Some said Ethan was found talking to himself, muttering words that made no sense. Others said they saw him walking the halls in the middle of the night, even though his cell was locked. And then there was the matter of the markings on the wall. Ethan had been in the cell for less than 48 hours when they found them. He had scratched something into the stone walls, symbols. Strange, arcane symbols that I had never seen before. They weren't anything like the gang tags or scribbles that most of the inmates put up. These were different, twisted, as though the person who had made them had lost their mind in the process. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but it terrified me. The air felt heavier around his cell, suffocating even. I could feel something in my bones, some dark presence that had seeped into the very walls of the prison. The guards, usually stoic and impervious to fear, were now whispering to each other about the supernatural. One of them, a young guy named Rick, told me that a couple of his colleagues had heard strange sounds at night. They swore they'd heard chains dragging across the floor and a low, guttural voice whispering their names. They said it was coming from Ethan's cell. "I don't believe in that crap," Rick said to me, his face pale. "But I can't explain what's going on. There's something in there, man, something dark. And it's not just Ethan." But then things took an even darker turn. I had always thought the worst part of prison was the fights, the stabbings, the constant feeling of danger. But what happened next was far worse than anything I could have ever imagined. It was around midnight when I heard it. A scream. Not just any scream, but one filled with raw, visceral terror. It came from Ethan's cell, piercing the quiet of the night like a knife. I shot up from my cot, my heart racing. The sound was unmistakable, and it chilled me to my core. I'd never heard anything like it before, not in all my years here. The scream was cut short, abruptly silenced, as if whatever had been making it had been smothered. I didn't waste a second. I banged on the bars of my cell, trying to get the attention of the guards. I could hear them shuffling outside, murmuring nervously. Then the sound of keys rattling as the guards rushed to Ethan's cell. When they opened the door, they found Ethan, his eyes wide with terror, his hands clutching the bars of the cell as if he was holding on for dear life. His mouth was moving, but no sound came out. He looked like he'd seen something no one should ever see. His face was ashen, his lips trembling as he pointed towards the back of his cell. But there was nothing there. Nothing that anyone else could see. The guards took him to the infirmary for observation. They thought he just snapped, but I knew better. There was something in that cell. Something that wasn't human, something that had been waiting for him. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The air was still thick with whatever had happened in that cell. I could hear the low murmur of voices outside, but nothing seemed right anymore. Every corner of the prison felt haunted, as if the very foundation of the building was shifting. I was sure I wasn't the only one who felt it, though no one dared speak of it aloud. And then, the next day, Ethan was gone. The guards claimed he had gone crazy and had to be transferred to a mental facility, but I knew that wasn't true. He wasn't crazy. He'd seen something. Something that had driven him to the brink of madness. Something that had taken him. But the strange part? No one ever talked about it again. Ethan's disappearance was swept under the rug, like everything else that was too dark to deal with. The walls of this place are thick, and secrets get buried in the cracks. But I knew that something was wrong. Something far worse than any prison sentence could contain. Whatever had taken Ethan was still here, lurking in the dark corners of the prison, waiting for its next victim. I can feel it. The whispers at night, the cold spots that seem to appear out of nowhere, the sound of chains dragging across the floor. And the worst part? I'm starting to hear that scream again. Only now, it's not coming from Ethan's cell. It's coming from mine.